The knock came at 2:14 in the morning. Nolan Voss heard it from under the chassis of a '09 Ford F-250, where he'd been lying on the cold concrete for the past hour trying to coax a seized brake caliper loose without snapping the bleeder valve. The garage at Ridgeline Auto on the edge of Pemberton, British Columbia had been closed since 6. The overhead lights were off except for the 2 work lamps Nolan had dragged under the truck with him. Outside, the rain was coming down the way it does in the sea-to-sky corridor in early October. Not dramatic, just relentless, the kind that gets into everything. He ignored the knock the first time, figured it was the wind catching the dumpster lid around the side of the building. The second knock was different. 3 slow, deliberate hits against the metal roll-up door, the kind a person makes when they're not sure anyone's there but they need someone to be. Nolan slid out from under the truck. He was 26 years old and had been working at Ridgeline for 3 years, the last 8 months as the only full-time mechanic after the shop's previous senior tech, a man named Jerry, had retired to Kelowna. He was lean, not in the way of someone who worked at it, but in the way of someone who didn't eat enough and spent too many hours on his feet. His hands were permanently stained along the knuckle lines, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He wore the same gray hoodie he'd been wearing since September because the shop's heating unit was unreliable, and the hoodie had deep pockets where he kept his ratchets. He stood still for a moment and listened. The knock came a third time. Nolan walked to the side door, not the big roll-up, but the regular door at the far end of the bay, and unlocked it and opened it 3 inches. The man standing in the rain was enormous. That was the first thing Nolan registered. Not the leather vest, not the patches, not the silver chain hanging from belt loop to pocket, just the sheer size of the man. He was well past 60, broad through the chest and shoulders, in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. His silver beard was soaked flat against his jaw. He was holding a helmet under one arm and the rain was running off it in a thin stream. He looked at Nolan for a second. "My bike's about 100 meters back up the highway," the man said. His voice was low and even. "She died on me. Fuel issue, I think. Something's wrong with the feed. I've been pushing her for 40 minutes. Nolan opened the door the rest of the way. The man's name, as Nolan would learn it, was Desmond Farrell, though the patch on his vest read Cutter, which was what everyone who knew him called him. He was a founding member of the Ironbound MC out of Prince George, a chapter with roots going back 30 years, and a reputation that preceded it the length of the province. The Ironbound weren't Hell's Angels, but they weren't far removed from that world either. They ran in overlapping circles, shared history with some of the older clubs, and were known as the kind of outfit that people in small towns along Highway 99 kept quiet opinions about. Nolan didn't know any of that yet. He just saw a man in his 60s, soaking wet, standing in the rain with a dead bike 100 meters up the road. He told him to go get it. They pushed the motorcycle in together, a 2006 Harley Davidson Road King, black with chrome that had gone slightly dull in the rain. Nolan got it up on the lift without asking permission. He turned on the overhead lights. He looked at the bike the way he looked at everything that came into that garage, like a problem that had a solution if you took it seriously enough. "How long since you filled the tank?" he asked. "Hinton. This morning. Did you fill it yourself?" Cutter looked at him. "I've been filling my own tanks since before you were born." "I know," Nolan said. "I'm asking because it matters." He pulled a fuel pressure gauge from the wall rack and connected it up. The reading was low. Lower than it should have been for a Road King running properly. He asked Cutter to hit the ignition. The engine turned over but didn't catch. He let it settle and checked the gauge again. Then he pulled the fuel line and caught what came out in a clean rag. The smell hit him before he'd even raised the rag to the light. Contaminated fuel, probably water intrusion. Possibly something introduced at the pump in Hinton if the station had been taking a delivery that morning and someone hadn't waited for the tanks to settle. "You caught a bad batch," Nolan said. "Whoever filled the station tank before you topped up, there was water in the line. It's worked its way through the system." He held the rag out so Cutter could see the slight iridescence in the stain. "You'd have made it maybe another 20 kilometers before it would have stopped catching completely." Cutter leaned against the workbench and looked at the rag. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Can you fix it? Tonight?" Nolan looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:31. "Depends on how deep the contamination is. I'll need to flush the tank, check the fuel filter, probably replace it, go through the injectors." He did a mental inventory of what he had on the shelf. "I've got the filter, injector cleaner, got a pump if I need it, but I don't think I will." He looked back at the bike. "I can have her running by 5. Cutter was quiet again. That was something Nolan would notice over the course of the next few hours. The man had no instinct toward filling silence. He either spoke because he had something to say or he didn't speak at all. "You should charge accordingly," Cutter said. "I charge what the work costs," Nolan said. "That's how I've always done it." He got to work. There is something about working on a motorcycle in a quiet garage at 3 in the morning that has no parallel in ordinary work. A car is a system, and a good mechanic understands systems. But a motorcycle is more personal than that. It's closer to the person who rides it, tuned to the way they ride, worn in particular ways that reflect choices the rider made without thinking about them. Nolan had learned that from Jerry before Jerry retired, and he'd carried it forward. He treated every bike that came into the shop like it had a history worth understanding before you started pulling it apart. He flushed the tank first, working slowly, not rushing it. Cutter sat in the battered waiting chair by the tool chest and watched without saying anything. Occasionally, Nolan asked him a question. How long had he owned the bike? Had it ever had fuel issues before? Whether he'd noticed any hesitation in the throttle in the days leading up to tonight. Cutter answered each question directly and without elaboration. Around 3:30, Nolan had the fuel filter out and confirmed what he'd suspected. It was saturated, had been absorbing moisture for longer than just tonight, which meant the bike had been running slightly rough for a few weeks, and Cutter either hadn't noticed or had written it off as normal age. He didn't make a thing of it. He just said, "You've got a new filter going in, and I want to run a cleaner through the injectors before we button it up." He glanced over his shoulder. "You want coffee? The machine's bad, but it's hot." Cutter said yes. They drank bad coffee from the machine in the little closet that passed for a break room. And somewhere between the fuel flush and the injector clean, they started talking in the way that men sometimes do when it's late, and the work between them has made them comfortable with each other. Nolan learned that Cutter had been riding since 1981, that he'd started on a beat-up '76 Sportster. He'd bought off a man in Fort St. John for $400, that he'd ridden from Prince George to Tuktoyaktuk the previous August because he'd always told himself he would and he wasn't getting any younger. Cutter learned that Nolan had grown up in Squamish, that his father had been a mechanic before him and had died when Nolan was 16, that he'd finished a 2-year automotive program in Chilliwack and come back north because that was where he knew people, and that he'd been at Ridgeline for 3 years and was the only full-time mechanic they had, and that the owner, a man named Terry Vance who operated the shop from an office in Whistler and visited maybe twice a year, had been talking for the past 4 months about bringing in a second tech and hadn't done it yet. "You like it here?" Cutter asked. Nolan thought about that for a moment. "I like the work," he said. "I'm good at it." That wasn't the same as yes, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it. At 4:47 in the morning, Nolan fired the Road King on the first crank. The sound it made in that closed garage was deep and clean, and exactly what a well-maintained V-twin should sound like after someone's taken the time to do the job properly. Cutter stood up from the waiting chair when he heard it. He walked to the bike and put one hand flat on the tank, feeling the vibration. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's her," he said finally, like he meant it. Nolan wrote up the invoice. Parts plus 2.5 hours of labor, because that was what it was. Cutter looked at it and said it was low, and Nolan said it was accurate, and Cutter paid it without further discussion, and added $200 on top of it, which Nolan accepted without comment, because he knew better than to argue with a man about his own gratitude. Cutter walked the bike out of the bay and into the early morning where the rain had softened to a mist. He put on his helmet and sat still on the idling machine for a moment. "What did you say your name was?" he asked. "Nolan," he said. "Nolan Voss." Cutter gave a single nod, the kind that means something was registered and filed. Then he rode out onto Highway 99 and was gone into the dark. Nolan locked up at 5:15, drove home to his apartment in town, slept for 3 hours, and was back at the garage by 9 to open for the regular day. He didn't mention to anyone that he'd stayed late. He didn't expect it to come up. It came up 11 days later. Terry Vance arrived unannounced on a Wednesday morning, which was already unusual. He typically called ahead, or had his assistant send an email. He parked his Audi in the customer lot and came through the front door at 10:20 and told the woman at the front desk, a part-timer named Beverly, who worked mornings 3 days a week, to send Nolan into the back office when he had a moment. Nolan had a 14 Tacoma on the hoist that he was 30 minutes into, but he'd heard enough in Terry's voice, even at a distance, to know that when he had a moment was not an offer of flexibility. He put down what he was doing and went to the back office. Terry Vance was 51, with the kind of face that stayed slightly flushed regardless of temperature. He dressed business casual in a way that had never sat naturally on him. He'd inherited Ridgeline from his own father 6 years ago and ran it as one of 4 small business investments he held in the corridor. The others were a storage facility in Squamish, a plumbing company in Whistler, and some kind of stake in a vacation rental platform that Nolan had never fully understood. He was not a mechanic. He had no particular feeling for the shop. He kept it because it was profitable, and he kept Nolan because Nolan kept it profitable. "Close the door," Terry said. Nolan closed it. Terry had a piece of paper on the desk in front of him, though he didn't look at it. "I got a call from our insurance carrier last week," he said. "They flagged an after-hours activity at this location. Security system logged an entry at 2:14 on the morning of October 3rd. He paused. "Someone accessed the shop outside of business hours. Do you know anything about that?" Nolan had known this conversation was coming in the way you sometimes know things are coming without quite being able to say how. He'd known it the way you know a storm is building when the light changes even though the sky still looks clear. "That was me," he said. "You were here at 2 in the morning." "Yes. Doing what?" "There was a man on the highway. His bike had died. Contaminated fuel. He'd been pushing it for nearly an hour in the rain. He looked at Terry steadily. I let him in and I fixed the bike. Terry was quiet for a moment. He turned the piece of paper over, as though something on the back of it needed consulting. Then he said, you know the insurance policy. After hours work is not covered. If that man had been injured on this property, he wasn't, or if anything in this shop had been damaged, nothing was. Nolan, Terry's voice went flat. You let a stranger into a locked commercial facility at 2 in the morning, without authorization, without notification, without following a single protocol that exists for the protection of this business and its employees. He leaned back slightly. I can't have that. Nolan looked at him for a moment. The man was in his 60s, he said. He was soaking wet. He was on a dark highway in the middle of the night and his bike was dead. I fixed it and I charged him fair and I got home by 5:15. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. Terry shook his head. I'm going to need your keys. Nolan pulled his shop keys from his pocket and set them on the desk. He didn't slam them down or drop them from a height. He set them flat, corner first, the way you set something down when you're being careful about how you're being. He left the back office. He went to his tool chest, because a man's tools are his own regardless of where he works. And he started loading them into the 2 large rolling cases he kept under the bench for exactly the kind of emergency that is not supposed to happen but always eventually does. Beverly watched from the front desk. She started to say something and then didn't. Nolan loaded his tools, wheeled the cases out to his truck and drove home. He did not call anyone that night. He sat in his apartment and looked at the wall and did the math that anyone in his position does at a moment like that. What he had in savings, what he owed, how long he could hold out looking for the next thing. Pemberton was not Vancouver. There were a finite number of shops. The nearest large center was Whistler, and the shops there were busy enough to sometimes be hiring, but not busy enough to always be hiring. He'd have to make calls. He thought about the Road King idling in that garage at 4:47 in the morning. The deep, clean sound of it. He didn't regret it. He just didn't know yet what it was going to cost him. What he didn't know, what nobody in Pemberton knew except for the people who needed to know it, was who Desmond Cutter Farrell was when he wasn't on his bike. In 1994, Cutter Farrell had put up the first $50,000 that seeded what would eventually become Farrell Northern Holdings, a diversified commercial real estate and property services company operating across northern and central British Columbia. He hadn't done it with a business plan or a bank loan. He'd done it with the money he'd saved working construction for 8 years, and a piece of land outside of Quesnel that nobody else wanted, and a brother who was smarter about numbers than anyone either of them had ever met. That brother's name was Garrett Farrell. Garrett Farrell, at the time Nolan Voss was loading his tool cases into his truck, was the CEO of Farrell Northern Holdings, which by that point controlled 43 commercial properties across the province, operated 4 service and trade businesses, and had recently entered into a development partnership with a municipality in the Cariboo that would represent the largest single investment in the company's history. He was based in Prince George and traveled constantly, and he had a specific and long-standing habit of calling his brother Desmond on Sunday evenings to check in, not because the company required it, but because Desmond had been the one who made it possible and Garrett had never forgotten that. The Sunday evening after Nolan was let go, Garrett called Desmond. Desmond told him about the night in Pemberton. He told it the way he told everything, without decoration, just the facts in order. The dead bike on Highway 99, the rain, the lights on in the garage at 2 in the morning, the kid who'd opened the door, the coffee, the fuel flush, the sound of the Road King firing on the first crank. He did the job right, Desmond said. Took his time, didn't cut corners, charged me fair and turned down a tip until I made it clear it wasn't optional. A pause. Found out this week they let him go for it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Which shop? He said. Ridgeline Auto, Pemberton. Owner's a guy named Vance. Garrett wrote it down. He always wrote things down. It was a habit from the early years, when keeping track of everything was the difference between staying solvent and losing the land, and it had never left him. What was the kid's name, he said. Nolan Voss. Garrett wrote that down too. He did not act immediately. That was not how he operated. He made phone calls first, to people he knew in the corridor, in Squamish and Whistler, people with long memories and no particular reason to protect Terry Vance's reputation. What he heard back was consistent. Ridgeline was well regarded because of its mechanic, not because of its management. The shop had been losing customers to a competitor in Squamish in the 2 years before Nolan arrived and had recovered after. It was in the language of the people Garrett talked to, good as long as you get the right guy. He also looked into Terry Vance. That took less time. It took him 11 days in total. 11 days from the Sunday phone call with Desmond to the morning. He drove a rented Jeep Grand Cherokee down Highway 99 from Whistler and pulled into the lot at Ridgeline Auto, where a temporary mechanic hired from a staffing agency was working on a Subaru, with the efficiency of someone who was doing a job rather than caring about it. Terry Vance was in his office. He always came in on Thursdays. Garrett Farrell walked in without an appointment. Beverly looked up from the front desk and asked if she could help him. He told her he was there to see Mr. Vance about a business matter. He said it the way people say things, when they don't need the help of the person they're talking to, but understand the value of being polite to them anyway. Terry came out of the back office with his hand already extended, because when a man in a well-made jacket walked into one of his businesses without an appointment and asked for him by name, Terry's instinct was always to shake first and understand later. Garrett Farrell, Garrett said, taking the hand. Something moved across Terry's face. The name Farrell Northern Holdings was not unknown to anyone doing commercial business in that part of the province. It moved the way the name of a weather system moves across a meteorologist's face. Recognition, and the immediate involuntary calculation of what it might mean. Of course, Terry said. Come on back. They sat in the back office. Garrett didn't waste time. He told Terry that Farrell Northern Holdings was in the process of expanding its trade services portfolio and was conducting an assessment of independent shops in the corridor as a potential acquisition, or alternatively as an anchor tenant in a new commercial service facility Farrell was planning to develop near Pemberton. He said the shop had been on their list for review. He said the preliminary numbers were promising. Terry sat forward in his chair. Garrett let him sit there for a moment. Then he said, I do want to understand one piece of recent operational history before we go further. I've heard from a few people in the area that there was a staff change recently. A senior mechanic. He kept his voice neutral, informational. Can you walk me through that? Terry's expression did the work that people's expressions do when they are trying to decide, in real time, how much of a true count will serve them best. He gave a version of events, liability protocol, after-hours access, insurance concerns. He used the word unfortunately twice. He said Nolan had been a good mechanic, but that the business had obligations that had to take precedence. Garrett listened to all of it without reaction. When Terry was finished, Garrett said, the mechanic in question, he let in a customer who was stranded on a dark highway in the middle of the night. Fixed the bike, charged him fairly, left the shop secure. He paused, and you fired him for that. Terry opened his mouth. That customer, Garrett said, was my brother. The office went very quiet. Terry stared at him. Desmond Farrell, Garrett said. He goes by Cutter. He's been riding that highway since before this shop existed. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk, voice still even, still measured. The man your mechanic helped in the middle of the night, at significant personal risk and for no personal gain, was the person who put up the original capital that built the company sitting across from you. The silence stretched. Garrett straightened. I don't think this shop is the right fit for what we're looking for, he said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I appreciate your time. He walked out of the back office, past Beverly, who had gone very still at the front desk, and out through the glass door into the late morning sun. He sat in the rented Jeep for a few minutes. He was not a dramatic person. He didn't feel the need to revisit what had just happened, or think about whether it had gone the way he'd intended it had. He'd said what he'd come to say, and Terry Vance would spend the rest of that day, and probably several days after, understanding exactly what it meant. Then he took out his phone and called his operations director. I need you to pull the file on that service facility site near Pemberton, he said, and find me a contact number for a mechanic named Nolan Voss. He's local. He was just let go from Ridgeline. I want to talk to him. Nolan was in his apartment on a Thursday afternoon, going through job listings on his laptop for the third time that week, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Prince George area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He was tired in the way you get tired when you're between things, and you can feel the weight of what you don't know yet pressing on every hour. But he picked it up. Nolan Voss, the voice said. Yes, my name is Garrett Farrell. I'm the CEO of Farrell Northern Holdings. I think you might know my brother. Nolan held the phone and said nothing for a moment. Cutter, he said. That's right. A brief pause. He told me what happened that night. He told me you let him in when you didn't have to. You fixed the bike when you could have sent him down the road, and you got fired for it 11 days later. Another pause. I'd like to talk to you if you're open to it. We're developing a commercial property near Pemberton, a service and repair facility, and I'm looking for someone to manage the mechanical operations. Someone who does the work the right way. A beat. My brother says you're that person. Nolan looked at the wall, out the window, at the laptop with the job listings on it. When do you want to talk, he said. The service facility opened the following spring, on a 2-acre commercial site just off the highway at the north end of Pemberton. It wasn't glamorous. A 4-bay garage, a small parts room, a proper lift for motorcycles, a waiting area with decent furniture and coffee that wasn't from a machine. The sign above the door read Ridgeway Service Center, which was Nolan's suggestion and which Garrett had agreed to without argument. Nolan Voss ran it. He hired 2 technicians, one with 10 years of experience, one fresh out of a program in Kamloops, and trained them the way Jerry had trained him. Slowly, carefully, with the understanding that the work mattered beyond the transaction. In the first year, the shop became the preferred service center for 3 motorcycle clubs operating in the corridor, including the Ironbound MC out of Prince George. Word in that community moves the way it always has. through trust, through reputation, through the specific and unforgiving economy of people who ride in all weather and need to know their bikes will start. Cutter came in twice that first year, not because his Road King needed anything. It ran clean and he maintained it well, but because he was passing through, and because stopping at Nolan's shop had become, without anyone deciding it would, a thing that he did. The second time he came in November, he sat in the waiting area while Nolan finished up with another customer. He had a coffee, proper coffee this time, from a machine that worked. He looked around the shop the way a person looks at a place they feel some ownership over, even though their name is on nothing. When Nolan came out and sat across from him, Cutter said, "Your father was a mechanic?" "Yes," Nolan said. "What would he think of this?" Nolan looked around at the bays, at the two technicians working, at the sign visible through the window. "He'd say the lift's not level on the left side," Nolan said. Cutter laughed. It was a short sound, but it was real. "He'd be right," he said. Nolan smiled. He didn't say the rest of it. That his father would have been proud, that doing the right thing in that garage at 2:14 in the morning had cost him everything he had at the time and led him somewhere his father would have recognized as worthy. He didn't say any of that because some things don't need to be said. Some things are already present in a room, the way the smell of a clean engine is present after the work is done. Not declared, not announced, just there, if you know what you're smelling for. Outside, the mountain light was doing what it does in the sea-to-sky corridor in November, coming in low and gold across the valley. A cold season was coming. The highway was already quiet. The Road King stood in the lot, and it was going nowhere tonight.